The morning her father died, the land didn't know yet. It just sat there. 912 acres of dark Iowa soil frost, still in the top inch waiting for spring the way it always had. Patient, indifferent, unchanged. Nora Vance drove out to the north field that afternoon and stood at the edge of it for a long time without moving. The wind came in flat off the open ground. The sky was the color of old tin. And somewhere in that field, in the frozen rows, her father had worked every season for 23 years. Something was still alive that she didn't understand yet. She would, but not before a man she'd known her whole life handed her a business card at her father's funeral reception and suggested gently that she might want to consider her options. Not before she found a green metal box in the back of the machine shed with a combination lock set to coordinates only one person would have known to try. Not before she understood that her father hadn't just been farming. He had been building something, and the people who wanted this land had known it. They had been waiting for him to die. They just hadn't planned on her. The morning they buried Thomas Vance, the sky couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Not quite gray, not quite white. Just that flat, indifferent color that sits over open farmland in March, when winter isn't finished, but spring isn't ready either. The kind of sky that doesn't care what's happening underneath it. Nora noticed it on the drive to the church. She noticed it again at the graveside, and she noticed it a third time when she was standing alone by the food tables at the Granger Hall reception, holding a paper plate she hadn't put anything on yet, looking out the window at a sky that had not changed 1 degree since morning. Her father would have said that was a good sign. Stable pressure, no weather coming. She set the plate down without using it. The hall smelled like casserole and old coffee, and the particular kind of grief that collects in rooms where people don't know what to say. Folding tables lined the walls. Someone had put out a display of photographs. Thomas at 30 standing in front of a tractor that looked almost new. Thomas at 45 squinting into afternoon light with his hand resting on a fence post, the way he always stood when he was thinking. Thomas and Nora at the county fair when she was 9 years old, both of them holding corn dogs, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. She couldn't remember what they had been laughing at. She had been trying to remember since she found the photograph that morning. People moved around her in small clusters. Some of them hugged her. Some of them shook her hand. Some of them said he was a good man, which was true. Some of them said he went peaceful, which she did not know to be true, and which seemed beside the point anyway. He had been alone in the cab of a John Deere 8R on a Tuesday morning in March, and his heart had stopped, and the tractor had kept moving until it reached the edge of the north field and ran into the fence post there. And that was how the neighbor 2 miles down had known to call. She kept thinking about the fence post, whether it held. She was thinking about the fence post when Broderick Crail came across the room. He came the way he always moved, unhurried, comfortable. The walk of a man who had spent 30 years being the largest equipment dealer in 3 counties and had never once had reason to doubt his welcome. He was carrying a paper plate with actual food on it, which for some reason irritated her. He said he was sorry for her loss. He meant it, probably. Broderick Crale was not a man who did things without meaning them. Then, he said he just wanted her to know that if things got to be too much, if the situation became difficult, if she found herself needing to think through her options, he handed her a business card. Nora looked at the card. Then she looked at him. "I know your number," she said. Broderick nodded. He had the grace not to say anything else. He moved away toward a cluster of men near the coffee urn, and Nora watched him go. And then she looked back down at the card in her hand. She knew his number because her father had called it. Years ago, when the equipment note came up for renewal. Before something changed. Before Thomas Vance quietly stopped doing business with Broderick Crale and never explained to anyone in Callaway County exactly why. She slid the card into her coat pocket. She would think about that later. She thought about it that night, actually sitting at the kitchen table after everyone had gone home and the hall had been cleared, and the leftover casseroles were stacked in the refrigerator in dishes that belonged to other people. She thought about it while she looked at the stack of documents her father's attorney, Catherine Mole, had walked her through that afternoon. The loan paperwork, the equipment notes, the summary of assets and liabilities that Catherine had laid out on the kitchen table with the careful, precise kindness of someone delivering a diagnosis. 912 acres. A John Deere 8R 3 years into a 6-year equipment note. A grain bin complex with an aeration motor that needed replacing. A loan at First Agricultural Lending for $1.2 million. Refinanced 18 months ago. Balloon payment due in 14 months. Nora read the loan documents twice. Then she read them a third time with a pencil and a yellow legal pad. On the second page, she found the appraised value used to secure the loan. $1,680 per acre. She wrote that number down. Then she wrote down what she knew about comparable ground in Callaway County. What it had been trading at for the past 3 years. What her father's own land records suggested it was worth. $2,400, $2,700, $3,100 for the best ground along the creek bottom. She stared at the two numbers for a long time. $1,680 and $2,400 minimum. She drew a line between them on the legal pad. Did not write anything beside it. Just looked at the line. Then she closed the folder, made a cup of tea she didn't drink, and went to bed. She lay awake until 2 a.m, thinking about the appraised value. She was up at 5:30 to feed the cattle. That was the first night. The county knew certain things about Nora Vance. Most of what it knew was wrong. It knew she had gone to the State Agricultural University and come back after 2 years. Most people assumed she'd dropped out. She had not dropped out. She had completed a Bachelor of Science in Agronomy in 3.5 years with a focus in soil science and precision crop management, and she had done it while working 20 hours a week in the university's soil analysis lab. And when she graduated, she had come home because her father had a meeting at the bank that concerned her. And because she had the specific feeling, the way you sometimes do, that something was shifting in a direction that required her to be present. She had never mentioned the degree to anyone in Callaway County. Her father had asked her not to. Quietly. Over dinner one evening the week she got home. He had said some knowledge you keep private until it's needed. He had said the people who announce what they know spend their energy on the announcement. He had said the ground doesn't care whether you have credentials. It just responds to what you do. She had understood what he meant. She understood it more now. The county also knew she ate breakfast at the Farmstead Diner every Tuesday morning. Booth by the window facing the grain elevator across the highway. 2 eggs over easy wheat toast, black coffee. She had started doing it at 15 when her father started taking her along on his Tuesday morning town run. They would get breakfast, go to the co-op, pick up whatever parts or supplies were needed, and drive home with the radio on low, and both of them quiet in the easy way of people who don't need to fill silence. She kept doing it after he died. She sat in the same booth, ordered the same thing, looked at the same grain elevator across the highway. The first Tuesday was the hardest. The waitress, a woman named Paula, who had known Thomas Vance for 20 years, brought the coffee without being asked, and then stood there for a moment, looking like she might say something. She didn't say anything. She just put her hand briefly on Nora's shoulder and walked away. That had been the kindest thing anyone did in the first week. By the 3rd Tuesday, the other regulars had stopped looking over with that careful sideways concern. By the 4th Tuesday, Nora had started bringing a notebook. She would eat and write and look out at the elevator and think. She was thinking those mornings about the loan documents, about the appraised value, about the fact that Broderick Crail had called Dex Pruitt at the Callaway Co-op the week after the funeral. Before Nora had filed a single piece of paperwork to assume farm operations. Before she had made any public statement about her intentions. Crail had called and asked whether the Vance estate would be continuing Thomas's seed and input program or starting fresh. Dex had mentioned it to her offhandedly when she stopped in to check on the feed account. He hadn't thought anything of it. Nora had thought quite a bit of it. She wrote it in her notebook. The date Dex said the call came in. The exact question Crail had asked. The fact that he had called before she had done anything official. She didn't say anything to Dex about what she was writing. She just thanked him for the information and drove home. She was learning that the most useful thing she could do most of the time was to say very little and write everything down. Her father had taught her that too, without ever saying it directly. Agnes Drury came to the funeral reception. This was noted by several people in the hall quietly, because Agnes Drury did not come to many public events anymore. She had farmed 800 acres east of the county road with her husband Harold until he died 6 years ago, and since then, she had been what people called private, which meant she did her business, maintained her land, and declined most of the social obligations that Callaway County expected of a widow of her standing. She was 71 years old, and she moved through the reception hall with the deliberate economy of someone who had decided exactly how long she intended to stay. She found Nora near the photograph display toward the end of the reception when most people had said what they needed to say and were looking for exits. She put her hand on Nora's arm. "Your father was a careful man," Agnes said. Nora waited. "Whatever he was doing out there," Agnes said, "don't let anyone talk you out of it before you understand it yourself." Then she released Nora's arm, nodded once, and walked toward the door. Nora watched her go. It sounded like the kind of thing people said at funerals. Grief-adjacent wisdom. The category of phrase that means well and says almost nothing. She filed it away in the back of her mind, behind the appraised value and the balloon payment and the business card that was still in her coat pocket. She thought about it differently 2 weeks later. The machine shed was the last building she inventoried. She did the grain bins first, then the shop, then the implement shed, working through the property, the way her father had kept records. Methodically, section by section. She had a clipboard with a printed list, and she moved through each building, checking condition, taking notes, photographing anything that needed attention. The machine shed was the biggest building on the property. It held the 8R, the planter, a disc ripper, a field cultivator, a grain cart, and the accumulation of 40 years of farming in a county where you never threw anything away because you never knew when you might need it. Tools hung on pegboards in arrangements her father had never changed. Oil cans on the shelf above the workbench in the same order she had learned to find them as a child. A calendar from a seed company on the wall open to March with a dentist appointment written on the 14th. The 14th was last week. She stood looking at the calendar for a moment. Then she kept moving. The green metal box was on a shelf in the back corner of the shed behind a row of hydraulic fluid jugs. It was painted the particular shade of dark green that industrial storage boxes are painted when they are designed to be unobtrusive. It was about the size of a shoebox. It had a combination lock on the front, the dial type with numbers 0 through 39. She almost missed it. She almost moved past it, actually. She was reaching for a hydraulic fluid jug to check the level when she saw the edge of it behind the row, and she stopped. Her father had not mentioned it in any of the conversations she could remember. Catherine Mole had not mentioned it in the estate inventory. There was no note, no label, no indication that it was anything other than a piece of storage equipment that had been on that shelf for years. She pulled it out. She tried the first combination that came to mind, her father's birthday month and day and year. Wrong. She tried the year he bought the Trang farm. Wrong. She stood holding the box and thought about her father, about the way he thought, about the things he had told her over the years that had seemed like general wisdom at the time, and that she was beginning to understand were specific instructions for specific situations. He had once told her that the best lock is one that only the right person knows to try. She thought about that. Then she thought about the north field, the home section, the ground her grandfather had broken and her father had spent his life improving, the parcel that appeared on every document, every map, every record she had looked at in the past 2 weeks. Section 14, Township 6, North Range, 6 East. She set the dial. 140. The lock opened. She stood there for a moment, not moving. Then she sat down on an overturned 5-gallon bucket and opened the box. 4 things inside. 2 composition notebooks, the black and white kind, spiral bound full to the last page. A USB drive, the standard thumb drive type, labeled in her father's handwriting with a single word: records. A folded survey map, the USDA soil survey overlay, kind worn along the fold lines in a way that suggested it had been opened and closed many times. And a sealed envelope with her name on the front. Nora. Her father's handwriting. She sat with the envelope in her hands for a moment without opening it. The big sliding door of the machine shed was open, and the March light came in flat and gray from the west, and she could hear the wind moving across the open ground outside. And somewhere in the upper structure of the shed, a piece of metal was ticking with the cold. She opened the envelope. 3 pages, handwritten in Thomas Vance's unhurried block print, the style of a man who had learned that legible was more useful than fast. She read it standing up. She hadn't meant to stand. She had been sitting on the bucket, and at some point in the first page she had stood without noticing. He had written about the land first, about what it had taken to build what his father had started, about the specific way the north field drained in a heavy rain, and what that meant for planting depth in the spring, about the creek bottom section, the south fields, the timber edge where the soil changed character and needed different management. He had written about her, about the summer she was 12 and had insisted on calibrating the planter herself and had gotten it exactly right on the second try and had not said anything about it, just moved on to the next task. And how he had understood something about her in that moment that he had never found the right words to say out loud. He had written about the notebooks and the drive and the map, what they contained, what she would find if she looked carefully, what she needed to understand before she made any decisions about the land or the loan or the people who would be calling her in the coming months with offers and suggestions and carefully phrased concerns. And at the end of the 3rd page, in the last paragraph, in the same unhurried block print, I don't know if you're reading this because something happened to me or because you found this box on one of your organized inventory runs, which honestly is equally likely. Either way, the plan for this season is laid out. The seed is at Briggs Cold Storage, 30 miles east on Route 9. It's paid for. The notebooks have everything you need. You know how to read them because you know how to read soil, and you know how to read numbers, and you know how to read ground the way I taught you and the way your grandfather taught me. You always knew how. I just needed you to know that I knew that too. Nora read the last line twice. Then she stood in the machine shed for a long time without moving. The wind moved across the open ground outside. The piece of metal in the upper structure kept ticking. The March light shifted slightly toward evening without warming anything. She was not a person who cried easily or often. She had not cried at the hospital when they told her. She had not cried at the funeral or at the graveside, or during the reception. She had cried once alone in the truck on the way home from the attorney's office for about 4 minutes, and then she had stopped and driven the rest of the way home in silence. She cried now, not because she was overwhelmed, not because she was afraid, because she was 24 years old and she had lost her father 6 weeks ago, and she had been holding the grief at arm's length the entire time, pressing it back with paperwork and inventory lists and loan documents and the specific focused practicality that she had learned from him. And now he had reached across whatever distance exists between the living and the dead and told her in 3 pages of block print that he had seen her clearly, that he had always seen her clearly, that he had trusted her with everything. She let herself cry for a while. No one was watching. The cattle were in the south lot. The fields were empty. When she was done, she put everything back in the box. The notebooks, the drive, the map, the letter. She closed the lid and set the combination and carried it to the house and put it on the kitchen table. She did not open it again that night. She sat at the table and looked at it while the light outside changed from gray to dark. She did not eat dinner. She made coffee she drank half of. She listened to the wind against the north side of the house, the way it had always come in March, the way it had come every March. She could remember the same direction, the same sound unchanged. At 9 o'clock, she got up, checked the locks on the back door, turned off the kitchen light, and went upstairs. She lay in the dark and thought about the appraised value. $1,680 per acre. Thought about the line she had drawn on the legal pad between that number and what she knew the ground was worth. Thought about Broderick Crail at the reception with his paper plate and his gentle suggestion that she might want to think about her options. Thought about Agnes Drury's hand on her arm. Your father was a careful man. Whatever he was doing out there, don't let anyone talk you out of it. She stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then she turned over and slept. There was a lot of work to do in the morning. The following Tuesday, she brought both notebooks to the farmstead diner. She ordered her usual, opened the first notebook, and began to read. Her father had dated every entry. The first one was 7 years ago, a Tuesday in April, in the same year she had started her second year at the university. The entry was short. Just the date, the field section, a soil temperature reading, and one line starting the north 40 on a modified rotation. See if the ground responds. She turned the page, and then she kept turning pages slowly in the booth by the window with her coffee going cold, while the morning moved around her, and Paula refilled her cup twice without being asked, and the grain elevator across the highway sat in the flat. March light unchanged, and Nora Vance began to understand what her father had actually been doing out there for the last 7 years. It was not what anyone in Callaway County thought. It was not what anyone in Callaway County would have guessed. And by the time she reached the last entry in the second notebook, dated the November before he died, she understood why he had kept it private. Because what Thomas Vance had built in those fields was not just a farming system. It was an argument, and the argument was not yet finished. The first notebook started on a Tuesday in April, 7 years ago. 40 acres, north section, a modified rotation Thomas Vance had designed himself, built around a winter rye cover crop sequence that nobody else in Callaway County was running. The entry was 3 lines long. The handwriting was unhurried, and at the bottom, in smaller print, a single observation: soil temp 2 degrees warmer than adjacent conventional ground. Note for spring. Nora read that line 3 times. 2 degrees in April on 40 acres. She turned the page. The second entry was 2 weeks later. Soil temperature again, moisture readings, a note about root development in the rye that was so specific it required the kind of attention most people didn't give to cover crops, because cover crops were not the point. They were the thing you did before the real crop, the thing between seasons. Except Thomas Vance did not appear to believe that anything was between seasons. He appeared to believe that everything was the point. Every reading, every observation, every degree of soil temperature, and every inch of root depth, and every note scrawled in the margin about what the ground seemed to be doing that he hadn't expected. She was 3 pages in before she understood that these notebooks were not farming records. They were a conversation. Between her father and the land he had spent his life learning to read. She read both notebooks in 4 sittings across 3 days. The kitchen table, the diner, the kitchen table again. Once in the cab of the truck parked at the edge of the north field, with the engine running for heat because the March cold had gotten serious again overnight. She read them the way she had been trained to read soil data. Slowly, looking for patterns. Not just what the numbers said individually, but what they said in relationship to each other. What happened in year 2 when the organic matter readings started climbing? What happened in year 4 when the cover crop sequence was adjusted? What happened to the nitrogen application rates as the soil biology recovered and began doing work that synthetic inputs had been doing before? 60% reduction in nitrogen costs over 5 years on 600 acres. She wrote that number on her legal pad and looked at it for a while. Then she looked at the yield data from the most recent season, the year before her father died. The modified fields had averaged 198 bushels per acre on corn, 20 bushels better than the conventional ground on the same farm, in a year when the county average was 171. She wrote that number down too. Then she wrote down what she knew about what that difference meant per acre at current corn prices. Times 600 acres across a full season. The number she arrived at was large enough that she put her pencil down and sat with it for a moment. The ground had been answering him for years. He had just never told anyone. The USB drive contained what the notebooks referenced. The full digital record, GPS mapped yield data going back 8 years. Soil sample results by field section with analysis notes in Thomas's shorthand. Equipment calibration files for the planter dated to 4 seasons ago. Input cost records that showed year over year the divergence between the modified acres and the conventional acres. What he had spent, what he had saved, what the ground had returned. There was also a folder labeled simply Observations. It contained photographs, hundreds of them, dated and labeled by field section. Root systems pulled from the ground and laid against a ruler. Soil cores photographed in cross-section showing the organic matter layer building year by year like sediment. Earthworm counts per cubic foot. The kind of documentation you did when you were building an argument you intended to prove. And at the back of the observations folder, a subfolder labeled External. 15 documents. News articles printed to PDF. A county property records summary. A state agricultural lending report. Notes in Thomas's handwriting typed and formatted about patterns he had observed in loan originations and property transfers in Callaway County over the previous 6 years. Nora opened the first document. Read it once quickly. Then read it again slowly. Then she got up from the kitchen table, walked to the window, and looked out at the north field for a long time without thinking about anything specific. Just looking. The way you look at something when your mind is working on a problem that your conscious attention hasn't fully caught up to yet. Because what her father had been building was not just a farming system. He had been building something else entirely. And she had 14 months to figure out what to do with it. She drove to Briggs Cold Storage on a Wednesday morning, Route 9 east, 30 miles out, and 30 miles back through the flat gray landscape of early April. The facility was a low metal building set back from the road behind a gravel lot. Efficient, unassuming. The kind of place that didn't need to look like anything because it functioned perfectly well without the advertisement. Rufus Briggs met her at the counter. He was 60 or so. Careful handshake. The unhurried manner of a man who dealt in long-term storage and understood that things moved at their own pace. She told him who she was. He nodded before she finished the sentence. "Your father came out here every year," Rufus said. "Very thorough man." She told him she was here about the order. He pulled the file. 3 varieties of open-pollinated corn from the University Extension Seed Library. Enough for 640 acres at the seeding rates Thomas had specified. Payment received in full, November of the previous year. 4 months before he died. She stood at the counter looking at the invoice. He had known. Maybe not that he was going to die, but he had understood that the season needed to be secured before anything else could be uncertain. He had paid for the seed in November, because November was when you made sure. When you locked things in. When you stopped leaving the future to the future. "Did anyone ever ask you about his order?" she said. Rufus thought about it. Took his time. "There was a call," he said. "Maybe September, October of last year." Man asking whether your father was a customer. Asked specifically about open pollinated varieties. Did he give his name? No. What did he sound like? Roof considered this with the same unhurried seriousness he seemed to apply to everything. Local accent, he said finally. Friendly. Like he was just asking. She wrote the detail in her notebook. September or October. Local. Friendly. She thanked Roof, loaded the seed inventory confirmation into the truck, drove back toward the farm. She got about 4 miles before she pulled over on County Road 9 and sat with the engine idling. Because it was time to look at the map. She unfolded it carefully. The USDA Soil Survey Overlay was printed on heavy paper, the kind that held up to handling, and Thomas had folded it along specific lines so that the portion he had marked was always in the center when you opened it. 4 circles. Red ballpoint pen, drawn with a straight edge so they weren't freehand. Precise, deliberate. The circles he drew when he meant something and not when he was thinking out loud. The first 3 circled farm parcels adjacent to the Vance ground. The 4th circled the Vance ground itself. She looked at the 3 adjacent parcels. She knew who had owned them, had known their families. The Hensley place north of the county road. The Draper ground east of the timber line. The old Westbrook operation, 340 acres that the family had sold 2 years ago when the father got sick and the sons had jobs in the city and nobody was left to run it. She knew the stories. Everyone in Callaway County knew the stories. Prices dropping, equipment costs rising, a bad year followed by a loan restructuring that didn't quite solve the problem, followed by another bad year, followed by a sale at a price that was probably fair given the circumstances, except that the circumstances themselves were the question nobody had asked out loud. She drove to the county recorder's office that afternoon, asked for deed transfer records on the 3 parcels, and 4 others she had pulled from the external folder on the USB drive farms she hadn't known personally, but that Thomas had flagged. She came back the next day, and the day after that. 2 full days in the county recorder's office, which smelled like old paper and fluorescent light, and the particular kind of institutional patience that county offices accumulate over decades. She photographed every document she found. The pattern took shape on the 2nd day around 2 in the afternoon, when she had the deed transfers laid out on the table in the order they had occurred, and she could see the whole sequence at once. A.H.G. Land Holdings, LLC. Delaware registration. Registered agent at a law firm address in the capital. Nothing on the surface that told you anything, but the acquisition record told you plenty. 2,400 acres, all in Callaway County, all within a 5-mile radius of the Vance farm, all acquired between 2018 and 2023 from farmers who had gone through loan distress situations at First Agricultural Lending, all appraised at the time of loan origination by the same individual. A contracted appraiser named Dennis Holt, listed as an approved vendor for First Agricultural specifically on agricultural property transactions, and Aldrich Foss. Aldrich Foss had handled every originating loan, every single one, and the equipment notes on 3 of the distressed farms had been financed through Broderick Crale's dealership. Notes structured with balloon payments in year 2 or year 3. Notes that had come due at precisely the moment when the farms were already thin on cash flow from the commodity price environment of those years. Not tricky to see once you laid it out, except nobody had laid it out, because each piece by itself looked like ordinary business: a loan, an appraisal, an equipment note, a farm in trouble. A sale, nothing unusual, until you put all the pieces on the same table and looked at them together. And then it looked like something very different. She photographed the last document, packed up her bag, walked out into the April afternoon, and sat in her truck in the county parking lot and looked at the windshield without seeing it. Then she called Catherine Mole. Catherine's office was in town's 2nd floor above the insurance agency, the kind of space that accumulated files the way farmland accumulated topsoil, slowly and usefully. She was mid-40s, direct, with the particular quality of stillness that good attorneys develop when they have heard enough complicated situations to know that rushing through the description helps no one. She listened to all of it: the 2 notebooks, the USB drive, the external folder, the appraised value discrepancy in Thomas's own loan documents, the deed transfer pattern, Dennis Holt's name on every appraisal, Aldrich Foss on every loan, Crale's equipment notes timed to the balloon. She listened without interrupting. When Nora finished, there was a silence. Then Catherine said carefully, "Do you understand what you're describing?" "I think I do." "If the appraisals were deliberately suppressed," Catherine said, "that is bank fraud." Nora nodded. If Crale was coordinating with First Agricultural to identify distressed borrowers and time the equipment financing to accelerate defaults, that is a conspiracy to commit fraud, Nora said. My father was documenting it. Another silence. You'd need evidence linking the parties directly, Catherine said. The records you found establish pattern. They don't yet establish coordination. There's more, Nora said. In the map. She unfolded the soil survey overlay on Catherine's desk, showed her the 4 circles, explained the drainage tile system, the Luvuk, the 3 AHG parcels surrounding the Vance ground on 3 sides, the buried pipe network that moved subsurface water across those parcels to the main outlet. The outlet that the Vance farm depended on entirely. Catherine looked at the map for a long time. If someone controlled those surrounding parcels, Nora said they could file for a drainage modification. Legally. Redirect the water, and the best ground in the basin becomes very difficult to farm. Not illegal, not on its own, but combined with the loan structure, the appraised value, the balloon payment timing, it becomes a mechanism. You engineer the financial distress. You acquire the surrounding land. You wait. And when the owner finally has to sell, the ground is worth less than it was because the drainage situation has been allowed to deteriorate. And you buy it at the bottom. Catherine sat back in her chair. Your father was not just building a farming system, she said. No, he was building a case. Yes, there was a long pause. The office was quiet. Outside the window, the main street of Callaway moved at its ordinary April pace, unhurried and unchanged. Then Catherine said something that sounded simple and was not simple at all. "Protect the box," she said, "and farm." Nora planted in May. Alone for the first week, running the planter herself, calibrated to Thomas's GPS prescription maps on her laptop, monitoring population rates by field section the way he had shown her when she was 17 and had first started riding along on planting days. The prescription maps were already loaded on the USB drive. Everything was already prepared. She just had to follow the plan, which was harder than it sounded. Not the technical part. She knew the technical part. The harder part was sitting in the cab of the 8R on the third day of planting, running the north section, and understanding for the first time in a visceral and unambiguous way that the man who had designed this plan was not going to see whether it worked. She kept planting. On the 7th day, Agnes Drury showed up. She came in a pickup truck that was older than Nora and in better condition. She got out with a coffee thermos and, without being asked, walked to the planter and bent down to check the seed depth on the last closed furrow. She knew what she was looking at. She stood up and said it looked right. Then she sat on the tailgate of her truck and poured 2 cups of coffee and waited. Nora climbed down from the cab. They drank the coffee. Agnes didn't say much, neither did Nora. But Agnes came back the next day and the day after that, and by the end of the 2nd week, there were 2 trucks parked at the edge of the field. And something that felt quietly and without announcement, like help. Word moved through the county the way word always moved. People drove slowly past on the county road and watched. Some of them were skeptical. Some were quietly curious. The equipment looked right. The rows looked right. But she was using seed nobody recognized. And she wasn't ordering chemical inputs from Crail's supply operation. That was noticed. Broderick Crail noticed it himself. He drove past the Vance place twice in 2 weeks. Nora saw him from the cab both times and kept driving the rows. She was thinking about the drainage tile on those days, about the map, about what it would mean if she ran out of time before she ran out of argument. And then on a Thursday evening in the 3rd week of May, she found the letter. Not a letter, a bank letter, printed on First Agricultural Lending letterhead, addressed to the estate of Thomas Vance, forwarded to Nora as the successor operator. 1 page. Formal language. The kind of formal language that sounds polite for the entire duration of reading it and only reveals its actual content in the last paragraph. First Agricultural Lending was reviewing the terms of the existing operating loan in light of what the letter described as changed operational circumstances. A representative would be in touch to schedule a review meeting at the borrower's convenience. She read it twice. Then she put it down on the kitchen table. Changed operational circumstances. She had not changed anything. She had assumed operations legally. She had filed every document Catherine had advised her to file. She had made the first quarterly interest payment on time electronically the way her father had always done it. Nothing had changed, except that she was not Thomas Vance, and she was 24 years old. And she was running a planter with seed nobody recognized and not ordering inputs from Broderick Crale's operation. And somebody at First Agricultural had noticed. She called Catherine, read the letter out loud. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Don't respond yet. Don't agree to a meeting date. Let me review the loan documents again tonight." Then she said, "How is the planting going?" "We're on schedule," Nora said. "Good. Keep planting." She hung up and sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time since she had found the green metal box in the back of the machine shed, she let herself think the thing she had been not thinking. What if she couldn't hold it? Not the loan, not the land, the whole thing, the plan, the argument Thomas had spent 7 years building, the case he had prepared for a verdict he would never see. What if she planted the seed and ran the rotation and documented every number the way he had taught her, and it still wasn't enough? What if the balloon payment came due and the bank found a reason to accelerate and the drainage tile application went through before the investigation had time to matter? What if careful and patient and thorough wasn't enough? What if the people with the money and the lawyers and the history of winning just kept winning? She sat with that for a while. It was not a comfortable thing to sit with. Then she reached across the table and pulled the green metal box toward her. She opened it and took out the first notebook. The older one, the one that started 7 years ago with 40 acres in the north section. She opened to the first page. The date, the field, the soil temperature reading, and at the very top before the date in Thomas's block print, a line she had read 3 times in the diner and not fully absorbed until now. North field, first frost, soil held. He had written that on the day she was born. She had not connected those 2 things before. That the first entry in this notebook, the record he had started before he even knew what the record would become, was dated the same day she had arrived. North field, first frost, soil held. She closed the notebook, put it back in the box, closed the lid. Then she got up, checked the weather forecast for tomorrow, confirmed it was clear, and went to bed. There was a full section left to plant in the morning. Agnes Drury was waiting at the field edge when Nora arrived at 6:15. 2 trucks, 2 thermoses. Agnes handed one over without ceremony. Nora took it, looked at her. "I need to ask you something," she said. Agnes waited. "What do you know about AHG land holdings?" Agnes did not change expression, but something shifted in the way she held herself. The thermos in her hand, the angle of her shoulders, very slight, very controlled. She said, "What makes you ask that?" "My father's map," Nora said. "He had your land circled, along with 3 others, all of them AHG acquisitions." Agnes looked out at the field. Harold, she said finally. My husband, fall of 2018. He took a refinancing loan that Aldrich Foss recommended. Commodity prices had dropped and things were tight, and Foss came to him very reasonably with a very reasonable proposal. Nora waited. The appraisal came back at $1,200 an acre, Agnes said. We were surrounded by ground trading at $2,200-$2,300. I said that to Harold. He said the bank had their own appraiser and we weren't in a position to argue. Dennis Holt, Nora said. Agnes looked at her. He appraised every farm that went to AHG, Nora said. Agnes was quiet for a moment. We sold 300 acres, she said. Winter of 2019. To satisfy the balloon payment when the operating income couldn't cover it. Harold signed the papers in January. He had a stroke in March. I'm sorry, Nora said. Agnes looked back at the field. He had farmed that ground for 31 years, she said. He had never in 31 years felt like he didn't know what he was doing. And then, in one season, he was signing papers to sell a third of it at a price he knew wasn't right to people he didn't know, because a bank officer he had trusted told him it was the only option. She stopped. The morning was quiet. The field stretched away from them half-planted. The light was coming in low from the east, the first real warmth of the season, and the turned earth was starting to smell the way it smelled in May, when the soil temperature was right and the season was genuinely beginning. Your father came to see me, Agnes said, in the spring of 2019, a few weeks after Harold died. He didn't say much. He just asked if I had kept the loan documents. I said I had. He asked if I would be willing to let him make copies. I didn't ask why. I just said yes. He knew, Nora said. He knew, Agnes said. Or he suspected. Which with a man like your father was more or less the same thing. He said to me that if he ever found what he was looking for, he would make sure I was part of the conversation. And then he died before he could. Agnes said nothing for a moment. Then she said, No. He left you the box. Nora filed the complaint in June. 2 complaints, actually, submitted on the same Tuesday morning. The first to the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. The second to the State Department of Agriculture's Commercial Practices Division. The OCC complaint included 6 loan files documented from the County Recorder's Office. The AHGLLC Incorporation records. Dennis Holt's appraiser registration. The full pattern analysis Thomas had assembled in the external folder. And the annotated soil survey map, which Catherine had formally documented as evidence in a potential fraud proceeding with Thomas's handwritten circles, and the drainage tile overlay she had added herself. The commercial practices complaint focused on the equipment financing structure, the balloon payment timing, the 3 farms where Crail's notes had accelerated precisely as the operating distress peaked. She did not tell anyone in Callaway County she had filed either complaint. She did not tell Agnes. She did not mention it to Catherine beyond the confirmation that everything was submitted. She did not bring it up at the diner on Tuesday morning or at the co-op when she stopped in for a parts order. She just kept farming. The crops kept growing. And Aldrich Foss called on a Thursday afternoon in the last week of June, which she had been expecting. He said he was calling as a courtesy to ensure she understood the timeline on the balloon payment, to let her know the bank wanted to work with her, to mention carefully that there was a private land investment group that had expressed preliminary interest in the Vance property, and that if she wanted to explore options, the bank could facilitate an introduction. She said, "What group?" He said he couldn't disclose that at this stage. She said, "I'll think about it." She hung up and called Catherine. "He just offered to connect you to the buyer while holding your loan," Catherine said. "I know. Do not agree to anything. Do not sign anything. Do not attend any meeting without me present." "I know," Nora said. There was a pause. "How's the corn?" Catherine asked. Nora looked out the window at the north section. 6 weeks in the ground. The plants were 18 inches tall, and the color was right, and the stand was so uniform it looked almost artificial, like someone had arranged it. "It's good," Nora said. "How good?" She thought about the notebook entries. The yield trajectory. What Thomas had documented in year 4, year 5, year 6 of the rotation. What happened when the soil biology fully recovered and the organic matter reached the threshold where the system started feeding itself? "I don't know yet," she said. "But I think it's going to be good." She hung up, walked out to the north field, stood at the edge of it in the June evening, the light going golden and long across the rows, and looked at what was growing. 7 years of preparation. In the ground, visible, real, not finished, not proven, not safe yet, but growing. And for the first time since March, since the flat gray sky above the frozen field, and the fence post at the edge of the north section, and the tractor that had kept moving after her father's heart stopped, Nora Vance felt something that was not grief and was not fear. It was closer to certainty. The ground was answering. July came in hot and stayed that way. Not the ordinary summer heat of central farmland. Something meaner. A dry press that settled over Callaway County in the second week of the month and didn't lift. The kind of heat that makes the air above the road shimmer at noon and turns the soil on conventional ground to something closer to concrete by 3 in the afternoon. Nora watched it happen from the cab of the 8R on the days she was running field checks. She watched the neighboring fields. She watched the way the leaves on conventional corn curled inward at the edges by midday. Rolling, which is what corn does when it is conserving moisture. When the root system has reached its limit and the plant is rationing what it has left. She watched, and then she turned and looked at her own fields. The leaves were not rolling, not the north section, not the creek bottom, not the long south stretch that Thomas had been rotating the longest the ground that had 7 full years of the system in it. The ground that was now carrying organic matter readings she had documented herself in May, and still found slightly difficult to believe. The leaves were flat and dark, and oriented toward the light the way healthy corn orients in the morning. Not conserving, not rationing, just growing, because the roots were deeper, because the soil structure had been rebuilt over 7 years to hold water the way a sponge holds water instead of the way compacted ground holds it, which is barely and briefly. Because Thomas Vance had understood something that most of Callaway County had stopped believing was practically achievable, that the ground could be taught to take care of itself. She walked the north section on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of July, the way she had been walking it every week since planting. Notebook in hand, measuring tape in her back pocket. The same protocol Thomas had established and documented and passed forward in 2 composition notebooks that were now held in a fireproof safe at Catherine Mole's office, along with everything else. She pulled an ear at random from the middle of the row, pulled back the husk, stood there looking at it. Full tip fill. Kernel rows set straight from base to tip. The kind of ear development that showed up in the last entries of Thomas's notebooks in his descriptions of what the system produced in years 5 and 6. The entries she had read and understood technically, but had not until this moment seen with her own hands. She stood in the row for a long time. Then she took out her notebook and wrote what she saw. The date, the section, the ear measurements, the observation in plain language. At the bottom she wrote, "He was right." Closed the notebook, walked back to the truck. She called Catherine from the field road. "We have a problem," Nora said. "What kind?" "The kind where I'm going to be very hard to lowball." There was a pause. How hard? She looked back at the field. The July light coming down full and flat, and the corn standing straight into it. Not rolling, not struggling, just there, doing what the ground had been prepared to let it do. "I don't know yet," she said. "But I think someone is going to be surprised." Cobb Slade arrived on a Monday in the 2nd week of July. He was 22. Grew up on a grain farm in the next county. Had the hands and the posture of someone who had been doing physical work since he was old enough to be useful, which on a farm meant younger than most people would guess. He came with a recommendation from Agnes Drury, which was not a small thing. He showed up at 7 in the morning in a truck that was older than Nora's by about 5 years and in comparable condition. He knocked on the back door. She opened it. He said he understood there was part-time work available. She looked at him for a moment. "You know cover crops?" she said. "Some. You know how to pull an ear and read what it's telling you." He thought about it, honestly, which she appreciated. "I know what to look for," he said. "I'd have to learn your system." She nodded. "Come in," she said. "I'll show you the notebooks." She spent 2 hours at the kitchen table walking him through the protocol, the notation system, the field sections and their individual histories, the way Thomas had documented observations and what those observations were intended to capture over time. Cobb asked questions that were practical and specific, and showed he was listening rather than waiting to demonstrate that he already knew things. At the end of it, she stood up and took a composition notebook from the drawer beside the refrigerator. New, unopened. She set it on the table in front of him. Write everything she said. He looked at the notebook. The date she said, the temperature, what you see. If something doesn't look right, write that too. What if I'm wrong about what I see? Then you're wrong, she said. Write it anyway. The point is the record, not being right. He nodded. He started the next morning, and he did what she asked. He wrote everything. The observations were tentative at first, careful in the way of someone who wasn't sure yet what detail was worth including. But they were honest. And honest was what the system needed. He reminded her in some oblique way she couldn't entirely articulate of herself at 17, riding along on planting days and learning by watching. The particular attention of someone who understands they are being trusted with something real. She didn't say that to him. She just let him work, and she kept watching the fields. The letter from Broderick Crale's attorney arrived on a Friday afternoon in the second week of August. Not a phone call, not a casual approach at the co-op. A formal letter on the letterhead of a firm out of the capital addressed to Catherine Mole as counsel for the Vance farming operation, with a copy sent directly to the farm address. Nora was in the cab of the tractor when Cobb brought it out to the field. He had driven out on the four-wheeler, which he only did when something needed attention. She saw him coming from 100 yards away and finished the row before she stopped. She read the letter sitting in the cab with the engine off and the door open and the August heat pressing in from all sides. It was 3 pages of attorney language, which meant it took 3 pages to say something that could have been said in 2 sentences. The substance was this: in consideration of the ongoing complexity of the operational and financial situation, Broderick Crale's interests were prepared to offer a structured resolution. A private purchase at what the letter described as a fair and carefully assessed market value of the entirety of the Vance farming operation. The purchase price, which was stated in the second paragraph, was sufficient to retire the first agricultural loan and associated equipment notes and return a cash settlement to Nora personally. The settlement figure was written out plainly. It was not a small number. She read it twice. Then she folded it, put it in her shirt pocket, climbed down from the cab, walked to where Cobb was waiting with the four-wheeler. He looked at her face, which apparently said something because he didn't ask anything. She drove back to the house and called Catherine. "He wants to settle," Catherine said after Nora read the letter aloud. "He wants to make it go away," Nora said. "Same thing from his perspective." She looked out the kitchen window. The north section visible from here. The corn, in full August development, shoulder-high dense, the kind of stand that made you understand why people had been farming this particular type of ground for 150 years. "The number is real," Catherine said. "I want to be clear about that. It would solve your immediate financial situation." Nora said nothing. "What are you thinking?" Catherine said. She thought about Agnes Drury's kitchen. The two of them sitting at the table in the spring, Agnes telling her about Harold. 31 years on that ground, signing papers in January. stroke in March. The way Agnes had said it. Steady and without drama, the way you say things you have had 6 years to finish grieving. If I take it, Nora said 6 families don't get anything back. She could hear Catherine processing that. The complaint is filed, Catherine said. The investigation proceeds regardless of what you decide. You taking a settlement doesn't stop that. But it changes the story, Nora said. It means they can say the Vance farm was a willing seller. It means there's no centerpiece. It means the families who didn't get a choice never see someone stand in front of a camera and say this was wrong. Another pause. That's not a legal argument, Catherine said. No, Nora said. It's not. She made the decision in the next 30 seconds. Not dramatically, not with ceremony. The way her father had made decisions, which was quietly and without leaving much evidence of the deliberation except in the outcome. Tell them no, she said. No settlement, no meeting. And you can tell them why if you want to. Why? Because we're 4 weeks from harvest, Nora said. And I want them to see the yield numbers first. Catherine said nothing for a moment. Then she said in the tone of an attorney who has been practicing long enough to know when a client has made a decision that cannot be argued with understood. She hung up. Nora walked back out to the tractor. Cobb was standing at the field edge with his notebook open, checking ear development in the nearest row. He had learned the protocol in 3 days. He was already doing it without being reminded. She climbed up into the cab, started the engine, and drove into the August field that Thomas Vance had spent 7 years building toward a result he had not lived to see. The federal investigators contacted Aldrich Foss in the second week of August. This was not information Nora had immediately. She learned it later from Catherine, who learned it through channels that were appropriate and documented. But the sequence of what happened next was something she reconstructed over the following months until she understood the shape of it. The OCC examination had found the pattern: 14 loan transactions over 6 years. The same appraiser on every agricultural property. Valuations running $400 to $700 per acre below comparable market transactions in the same period. The same loan officer originating every account. Equipment notes from a single dealership structured with balloon provisions that had in 12 out of 14 cases accelerated at precisely the point of maximum operational stress. Not proof of coordination. Not yet. But the pattern was not ambiguous, and when the examiner traced the beneficial ownership of AHG Land Holdings, LLC, through the Delaware registration to the holding entity behind it, what they found was 2 names. Broderick Crail and a regional developer named Maddox Shell, who had in the event files of his own company a project prospectus for a large-scale commercial grain processing facility. Requiring the prospectus noted a minimum of 3,000 contiguous acres in a basin with established drainage infrastructure and proximity to a Class A rail corridor. The Callaway Basin, specifically. The 3,000 acres he needed were 2,400 already acquired, plus the 912 acres of the Vance farm. The plan had a name in his own documents. He had called it Basin Complete. Aldrich Foss was contacted by the examiner on a Wednesday morning and had retained his own attorney and begun cooperating by Thursday afternoon. He did not appear to have been told that cooperation was optional. He appeared to have understood, upon seeing the pattern laid out in a federal examiner's preliminary findings, that the shape of the situation had changed. Broderick Crale was contacted on a Friday. He did not cooperate on Friday. He did not cooperate the following week. His attorneys filed 2 preliminary objections and sent a letter to the OCC examiner's office that Catherine described on the phone to Nora as aggressive and not well advised given the documentation available. On the 10th day, Broderick Crale cooperated. Nora was in the combine when Catherine called to tell her this. Running the north section. The harvest had started 3 days earlier, and she had been in the cab for 12 to 14 hours a day, which was not unusual for harvest and which she had been managing with the particular focused endurance that harvest requires. She did not stop the combine when her phone rang. She answered it with one hand and kept the header moving. Catherine told her about Foss, about Crale, about Maddox Shell and the project prospectus, and the name Basin Complete. Basin Complete, Nora said. Yes, he had named it. He had a PowerPoint, Catherine said, with projected returns. Nora drove the combine through the north section and watched the yield monitor on the console and listened to Catherine explain the sequence of what had happened and was continuing to happen, and what it was likely to mean for the loan restructuring, and the AHG parcels, and the drainage tile situation, and the 6 families who had sold their ground at prices that were now documented as artificially suppressed. She listened to all of it. When Catherine finished, she said, "What happens to the loan?" "It gets restructured," Catherine said. "Full market value appraisal, current comparable pricing. The bank absorbs the difference between what was used to originate and what the ground is actually worth." "And the balloon gone," Catherine said. "New terms, proper terms." "What about the AHG parcels?" "Voluntary compliance hold pending investigation. They can't file for drainage modifications. They can't transfer the parcels. They can't do anything with that ground until the investigation concludes and a consent order is in place." "How long?" 2 years minimum. Probably longer. Nora drove another 50 yards into the field. The combine was pulling in corn at the rate she had calibrated it to, and the yield monitor was showing numbers that she had been watching for 3 days with the careful, disciplined attention of someone who needed to see the full run before she let herself understand what she was seeing. Nora Catherine said, "How's the crop?" Nora looked at the yield monitor. She had been looking at it all week. She had been looking at it with the specific caution of a person who has been trained by a scientist to not trust a single data point. Who knows that one good field doesn't mean the whole farm? Who knows that one good week doesn't mean the whole harvest? But this was the 3rd week, and it wasn't one field. "Come out at the end of the week," Nora said. to the farm. Bring something to write with, Nora said. She hung up and drove the combine into the standing corn and watched the numbers move. The harvest ran 3 weeks. The north section first, which was always first because the drainage was better and the soil temperature came up earliest in spring, which meant the season started a few days sooner and ended a few days sooner at the other end. Then the creek bottom. Then the south stretches the ground. Thomas had started the rotation on 7 years ago, the ground that had the longest history of the system, and the readings she had been watching most carefully since July. Cobb ran the grain cart. He kept up. He also kept his notebook filling pages during the brief windows between cartloads, writing observations in the shorthand he had developed over the summer from the protocol she had taught him and the modifications he had made himself as he learned what was actually worth recording. She didn't tell him to do that. He just did it. That was the thing about the right person. You didn't have to explain the whole system to them. You just had to show them where the attention belonged, and they figured out the rest. The county FSA office was on Main Street in town above the pharmacy. Nora walked in on a Tuesday morning in the first week of October, 3 weeks after she had run the last pass on the south fields and cleaned the combine and parked it in the machine shed, and stood in the empty field for about 20 minutes, just looking at what was left. The woman behind the counter had worked that desk for 22 years. Her name was Phyllis. She was practical and thorough, and she processed crop insurance documentation with the specific brisk competence of someone who had seen enough seasons to not be surprised by much. Nora handed her the form. Phyllis began processing it, entered the field sections, entered the harvested acreage, 612 acres. Then she entered the yield figure and stopped. She looked at the form. Then she looked up at Nora. Then she looked back at the form. "Did you verify this?" she said. "3 times, Nora said. Phyllis looked at the form again. The way you look at something when your eyes are telling you one thing and your experience is telling you something slightly different, and you need a moment to let those 2 things negotiate. Because in 22 years behind that desk, processing yield documentation for farms across Callaway County, through good seasons and bad seasons, and the catastrophic season of 2012, and the surprisingly strong season of 2018, Phyllis had not seen a number like the one on the form in front of her. 247 bushels per acre on 612 acres. The Callaway County average that year was 183 bushels per acre. Already a decent year. Already a year people would remember as solid. The previous county record had been set in 2018 by a 4,000-acre operation running full precision agriculture proprietary seed varieties and a complete synthetic input program managed by an agronomist on staff. That operation had averaged 231 bushels per acre, and people had talked about that number for years afterward, the way people in farming communities talk about numbers that seem to mark a before and after. Nora Vance, 912 acres total operation, 612 harvested on the modified system. Open pollinated seed varieties from a university extension program. cover crop rotation her father had designed in 2 composition notebooks over 7 years. No proprietary inputs, no corporate agronomist. 247. Phyllis processed the form in silence. She did her job completely and correctly because that was the kind of person she was. But when she handed back the receipt copy, she looked at Nora for a moment longer than the transaction required. "Your father," she said. "Yes," Nora said. Phyllis nodded, slowly. The nod of someone fitting a thing into place. "He would have been glad to see this," she said. Nora took the receipt. "I think he already did," she said. In a way. She walked out into the October morning and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The town was doing its ordinary Tuesday things. The pharmacy was open. 2 pickups were parked in front of the hardware store. The grain elevator at the edge of town had a line of semis waiting at the scale house, which was normal for October, which was when the county's harvest moved. She had been part of this for 24 years. The Tuesday rhythms of a small agricultural town that measured its seasons in bushels, and the price board at the elevator, and the equipment notes that came due in the spring. She had grown up in it, and now she had broken the record it had spent 50 years building. She got in her truck and drove home. The Callaway Register ran a story the following week. A regional agricultural journalist named Walt Greer, who wrote for a publication that covered farming operations across 5 states, and who had the specific combination of technical knowledge and narrative instinct that made him useful rather than merely present, drove down the county road and knocked on the farmhouse back door. Nora let him in. They sat at the kitchen table, which had over the past 7 months accumulated a particular quality of working surface. The notebooks stacked at one end. The legal pads with their columns of numbers. A soil map tacked to the wall above the table that she had added to over the summer with her own field observations. Cobb's notebooks, in a pile beside hers, 2 full volumes of daily observation entries. She showed Greer the system, the way Thomas had designed it, the rotation sequence, the cover crop logic, the nitrogen reduction data, the yield trajectory over 7 years that the notebooks documented, and the current season's harvest had extended beyond what even the trajectory had projected. She walked him through the soil science, slowly, without condescension and without abbreviation. She treated him like someone who could understand it if it was explained clearly, which turned out to be accurate. He asked good questions. He had done enough homework to ask about the drainage tile situation and about the relationship between the soil structure improvements and the July dry stretch and what the moisture retention data looked like compared to neighboring conventional fields. She answered all of it. At the end of the interview, which had run 40 minutes past what either of them had planned, Greer closed his notebook and said the thing journalists say when they are doing the polite version of their job. "Is there anything else you'd like people to know?" She thought about it. She thought about Thomas at the fence post, the way he had checked roots by hand, The way he had written observations for 7 years in a handwriting that nobody had seen because he had not shown the notebooks to anyone. The 40 acres in the first spring, and then 60, and then 120, and then the whole 600 year by year, the argument building. She thought about Agnes Drury at the reception. That hand on her arm, the specific knowledge behind that warning. She thought about Harold Drury signing papers in January, stroke in March. She thought about Cobb filling 2 notebooks over a single summer because she had told him to write everything, and he had understood without being told why that the record was the thing. My father used to say the ground doesn't care whether you have credentials, she said. It just responds to what you do. I think that's the thing. Whatever system you believe in, whatever approach you use, the ground eventually tells you whether you were right. You can't argue it out of an honest answer. Greer wrote that down. He drove away at 4 in the afternoon. She stood on the porch and watched his truck turn onto the county road and head south toward town. Then she went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the notebooks. Hers, Cobb's, and Thomas's 2 back from Catherine's office now that the legal proceedings were past the point where physical evidence was at risk. 4 notebooks, 2 voices, 3 seasons, and an argument made in numbers and root depths and soil temperatures and yield data that the ground had finally finished making for them. The consent order came through in the spring. The OCC matter was resolved through a formal agreement requiring First Agricultural Lending to restructure the 14 affected loans at proper market value terms and pay restitution to the impacted borrowers. 6 farm families in Callaway County. The restructuring figures varied. Some had sold early and the calculation was complicated. Some had sold more recently, and the gap between the suppressed appraisal value and the current market was stark and documentable. Catherine had been involved in 3 of the 6 cases as counsel and had negotiated with the competence and tenacity Nora had come to understand was simply how Catherine operated. 3 of the 6 families received enough to begin farming again. Nora found out about Agnes on a Tuesday morning. Catherine called at 7:15, which was early for Catherine, and gave her the numbers. She drove to Agnes's house. It was a farmhouse of the same general era as the Vance place. White clapboard, metal roof, a large kitchen that faced east for the morning light, which was the way farmhouses were built in this part of the country when the people building them understood that morning light was when you needed a kitchen to be working. Agnes opened the back door before Nora knocked. She knew why Nora was there. She had already heard from Catherine. She was standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hands, and her expression was the controlled, composed expression of a woman who had been managing difficult feelings for a long time and was not going to stop now. They went inside. Agnes made coffee without asking. They sat at the kitchen table. Agnes poured. The morning light came in through the east windows across the table between them. Nora told her the number. Agnes listened. She did not cry. She held the coffee cup in both hands and looked at the surface of the coffee for a moment after Nora stopped talking. Then she said, Harold would have wanted to know this. I know, Nora said. They sat with that for a moment. He would have wanted to know it was over. Agnes said. That the record was set right. It's set right, Nora said. Agnes looked up, and then, for the first time in the 8 months, Nora had known her Agnes Drury's composure moved. Not broke, not collapsed, just moved. A small shift in the line of her mouth, a brief closing of the eyes. The momentary surface evidence of something deep and long held, and finally carefully released. She reached across the table and put her hand over Nora's hand. They sat there in the kitchen with the morning light coming in, and neither of them said anything else for a while. They didn't need to. Walt Greer's article ran in October, timed to the anniversary of the harvest. It appeared in the Regional Agricultural Journal and was picked up by 3 state newspapers and a national farming publication that ran it as a feature with a photograph. The photograph was taken by Greer at the end of his visit the afternoon of the interview. Nora standing at the edge of the north field in harvest gear. Canvas jacket, work pants, worn boots with mud still on them from the morning field walk. She was looking out at the harvested field, not at the camera. She was holding something in her right hand. The first notebook. The one Thomas had started 7 years ago in the April. He planted the first 40 acres of the rotation on the north section. The machine shed was visible in the background of the photograph set back across the gravel. The light on the shed was on. The timer Thomas had set years ago clicking on at dusk and clicking off at midnight, the same timer that had run every evening for as long as Nora could remember. It cast a long rectangle of yellow light out across the gravel toward the field. People who read the article and saw the photograph understood something from it, even if they couldn't have articulated exactly what. Something about continuity, about the relationship between a careful man and the daughter who had inherited not just his land, but his method, his patience, his understanding that you do not argue with the ground. You listen to it. You prepare the conditions, and then you wait for the honest answer. Broderick Crail's dealership went through a license review process the following spring. His equipment franchise was suspended pending the outcome of additional proceedings. Aldrich Foss left First Agricultural Lending before the end of the year. Nora heard this from Catherine, who mentioned it briefly and without editorializing the way you mention a fact that speaks for itself. Dennis Holt's appraiser certification was under review by the state licensing board. Catherine said this process was likely to take some time, which meant it would take some time, which was fine. These were the outcomes, real and documented and eventual. The kind of justice that moves through institutions at institutional speed, which is slow, but which is also, in its own way, thorough. Which leaves a record. Which means the next time someone tries to build a basin complete, there is a record of what happened the last time. That mattered. Not as much as the land, not as much as the families, but it mattered. In the spring that followed, Nora expanded the rotation to the full 912 acres. It was a bigger operation than Thomas had completed before he died. He had been moving toward it year by year, acre by acre, the way he moved toward everything, with patience and without announcement. She was moving toward it the same way, except that she had his notebooks and his data and 7 years of proven results, and a 22-year-old named Cobb Slade who showed up every morning and filled pages in his composition notebooks with observations that were getting sharper and more useful every week. She had also started getting calls. The university extension program first. Then a soil science researcher from the college she had attended, a woman who had seen Greer's article and wanted to talk about the organic matter data and the nitrogen reduction figures, and whether Thomas had ever considered publishing his methodology. Nora had sent her copies of the notebooks and the USB records. The researcher had gone quiet for 2 days and then called back and talked for an hour and a half. Then a farmer from the next county. Then 2 farmers from 3 counties over. Then a woman who had read the article to her husband out loud at their kitchen table, and then called the journal to ask how to get in touch with the Vance operation, because they had been doing something similar, smaller, less documented, and had felt for years like they were doing it alone. She wasn't alone. That was the thing. That was what Thomas had not known when he started the first 40 acres. He had not known whether anyone else was thinking along the same lines, whether the system he was building had precedent or community, or whether it was just him and the ground and the notebooks and the patient long game of trying to prove something that everyone around him assumed was already settled. He had built it alone because that was what the situation required, and now it wasn't alone anymore. On the last day of April, Nora drove out to the north field at sunrise. Not to work, not to check something or measure something or document something, just to stand at the edge of it for a few minutes before the day started. The cover crop was up. Winter rye, the same variety Thomas had started with, grown to 4 or 5 inches now, and that particular vivid green that cover crops reach in the early spring when the soil temperature is right and the season is genuinely beginning. The field had a different quality in the early morning than it had at other times of day. The light came in low from the east and hit the rye at an angle that made the green almost luminous. Not dramatic, not spectacular, just clean and real and alive. She stood there in her jacket with her hands in her pockets and looked at it. She thought about the first Tuesday she had sat alone in the booth at the farmstead diner with her coffee going cold and her plate untouched, and the grain elevator across the highway unchanged, and the grief in her chest like something heavy and permanent. She thought about the green metal box with the combination that only one person would have known to try. She thought about 3 pages of block print in the machine shed doorway with the March light coming in gray and low. You always knew how. I just needed you to know that I knew that too. She thought about what it means when someone trusts you with everything. Not just the land, not just the notebooks and the records and the plan, but the knowing, the being seen, the quiet declaration made across whatever distance exists between the living and everything that comes after that. You were witnessed. That who you were was not invisible to the person who mattered most. There is no word for what that is. Or if there is, it's not a single word. It's the thing that gets you up at 5:30 when the grief is still heavy. The thing that puts you back in the cab of the combine after the bank letter and the settlement offer and the long nights at the kitchen table with the legal pads. The thing that makes you walk the field rows in July in the heat of a dry stretch, checking ear development and writing it down because someone prepared this ground and you are the one who gets to see whether he was right. He was right. She knew that now. Not just in the yield data, though the yield data was unambiguous, in the ground itself, in the way it felt underfoot, which was different from conventional ground in a way that was not imaginary and was not minor, denser and more alive, like standing on something that was paying attention. She had spent the winter reading everything she could find about the science behind what Thomas had been doing. The soil biology literature, the long-term rotation studies, the organic matter research that had been accumulating in academic journals for decades, while most of practical farming moved in the other direction. She wanted to understand not just what he had achieved, but why it worked, the mechanism behind the result. And what she found was that the system worked the way it worked because it was built on a correct understanding of what the ground actually needed. Not what was convenient, not what was easiest to sell, not what produced the fastest short-term return on the investment in inputs. What the ground actually needed, which was time, attention, the willingness to build something that wouldn't show its full results for years, the patience to start with 40 acres and trust the long process, even when no one else could see what you were doing or why. Thomas Vance had understood that, and he had left her enough to understand it too. The sun was fully up now, the early April light warm enough to feel on her face for the first time since autumn. Behind her, she heard a truck on the county road. Cobb probably arriving at the usual time, which was 6:30, now that the season had started. She heard the truck turn into the farm drive. The engine cut. A door. She did not turn around immediately. She took another moment at the field edge. The rye moved in a slight wind from the east. The kind of movement that wasn't dramatic. Wasn't the big wind of harvest season or the hard press of July heat. Just the ordinary movement of a living field in the early morning, adjusting, breathing, doing what it had been prepared to do. She heard Cobb's footsteps on the gravel behind her. Then stop. He had learned over the months when she was in the field because there was work, and when she was in the field because she needed a minute. He had learned to read that difference the way you learn to read most things on a farm. Not from being told, from paying attention. He waited. She took one more moment, then she turned around. He was standing at the field edge with his jacket on and his notebook already in his hand and his boots planted in the gravel with the particular steadiness of someone who intends to stay. "Ready," she said. He opened his notebook to the first blank page. "Ready," he said. She walked toward the field, and the season began.